tonight's class is a lot of fun. I know I say that every week, but this week is going to be really fun because we get into a lot of evidence for ancient Israel. And the evidence that we get into is going to be very solid. This is where most scholars agree that ancient Israel existed as a nation, where there's a pretty much a good consensus that the history from about the 9th century onward is pretty solid. Now, you do have those very skeptical scholars who will say that scribes within Israel went to Assyria. They saw all the writings, all the reliefs on the walls there at the palace, and they came back to the kingdom of Israel and Judah, I might add, and they manufactured Israel's history. Well, they manufactured Israel's history from a place that already existed. So again, it becomes very circular reasoning. Assyria records the history for a lot of nations, not just Israel. So what you find is some very solid history. So we're going to go into this. But what I want to look at first is going to be the theology behind why the Canaan conquest and then why the conquest of Israel. Why do we see that there is this cycle of something happening to Canaan, and then the very thing that happens to Canaan ends up happening to Israel? Why do we see that? So we're going to look at that, and I have a lot of slides tonight. I always want to get so far in this. I didn't get quite as far as what I wanted to, but that gives us something fun to do next week. So I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow. Let me get this going. All right, so I'm going to wait for it to come up before we get into it too deeply. And hopefully I have all my parameters correct here. Like I said, I was busy running around, went to the park with the kids today, and then I usually have my slideshows done much earlier in the day, but that did not happen this week. It was one of those crazy busy weeks. My son got his wisdom teeth out this morning, and surprisingly, he's acting as though nothing has changed. He's trying to go about his normal day. I bet he'll be a little bit sorry for that tomorrow, but hopefully he'll bounce right back. So tonight's class, we're going to get into the whys of the diaspora, the whys of the deportation of both Israel and Judah. Now, I think most of you are familiar with the fact that after King Solomon died, remember King Solomon rebelled against Yehovah. Yehovah had appeared to him twice in a dream. He had offered him a covenant. This covenant of peace that Yehovah offered to Solomon gave him basically the desires of his heart. And the one thing that Solomon asked for was the ability to judge Israel righteously, the ability to judge Israel with wisdom. And God was very impressed with this. He was very moved by it, and he granted Solomon's request. Well, after Solomon had his request, his heart turned away from Yehovah, and he began worshiping other gods. So because he rebelled, Yehovah stated that he would split the kingdom in two. He would reserve 2 tribes for the north, for the southern kingdom, and 10 tribes would go to the northern kingdom. Shabbat shalom, Patty. I'm so glad you all could make it. Welcome, Rome, New York. So what you find is that this fracturing of the kingdom plays a very big role in Israel's history. It really defines it. It would almost be the same for the United States if the North had split from the South and we had become 2 nations on one geographical territory. So if we had a North and a South today, we would likely clash over matters of policy, matters of rights, matters of which undertakings and what policies are we going to collaborate on, and then what are we going to perhaps be a little bit more aggressive regarding with that eternal conflict. Because the issue that you have when you dwell on a continent that is a geographical territory is that your common defense is really kind of interdependent on each other to a certain degree. Now, you really didn't have that so much in ancient times because the nations were a lot smaller and everyone kind of protected themselves. What you do find is that they formed alliances. So as you come in, we'll talk about it in a minute, but as you come into the later years of the monarchy, you find that because they are so weak, they start forming alliances with Syria, Damascus, with Egypt, and with all the smaller kingdoms there surrounding Israel and Judah. And they do this so that they can have the manpower to resist the Assyrian aggression into the land of Israel. Now, the first thing that I want to look at tonight is a statute in Israel that is very important. I would say that this command and the judgment associated with this command is one of the most important judgments for Israel in their history. The reason it is so important is because unlike the curses of the law, which only affect some of the people that are disobedient, or unlike the curses of the law that occur at different times in Israel's history, this judgment really affected the entire Israelite and Judah populace. This was a national command and a national judgment that the nation did not escape. And we're going to see that as we go along. So this was the command in Numbers 33. And this is a command given by Yehovah for Moses to speak to the children of Israel. It says, speak to the children of Israel and tell them, when you have passed over Jordan into the land of Canaan, and you shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land and dwell therein, for I have given you the land to possess it. I call this the 4 Ds. In English, it renders as each command begins with a D. It does not. It is not that in Hebrew, but I did this for the English version because it's easy to remember. So the command for Israel was to dispossess the Canaanites that already lived there and to dwell in their stead. The next command was to divide the land by a lot for an inheritance among your families. To the more you shall give more, and to the fewer you shall give less of an inheritance. Every man's inheritance shall be in the place where his lot falls, according to the tribes of your family. So the idea here is that, remember in Genesis 15, verse 16, Yehovah tells Abraham, he says, I am giving you this land, but you cannot inherit it in your lifetime. You really can't even inherit it in the lifetime of your children or your grandchildren. But he says, your children shall go down to Egypt. They shall serve them. And after 400 years, in the 3rd generation, I will bring them up out of Egypt and they will inherit the land. So what you find is that 430 years from the time that Yehovah gives the promise to Abraham until the exodus out of Egypt is 430 years. The reason Yehovah states he cannot give the land of Canaan to Abraham or his descendants was because the sins of the Amorites had not yet come into the fold. And this really demonstrates the impartiality of Yehovah as a creator and as all nations being his children. Yehovah wasn't going to judge a righteous people. He was going to wait for them to reach degradation until they were worshiping other deities, until, if you remember in Leviticus 18, Yehovah cites the immorality, the bestiality, the homosexuality, everything that the Canaanites were contributing and they were participating in. And in Leviticus 18, it says, when the inhabitants of a land participate in these types of immorality, it says the land itself will spew you out of the land. So you find that this is kind of a natural law, that when a land becomes delved into iniquity, that this is either a national judgment or it is a divine judgment, regardless of whether it's natural or perhaps an injunction directly by the hand of Yehovah where he takes an active role. We find this happening throughout history, and it usually occurs at 430-year intervals. So this is going to be something we're going to see throughout Scripture, is this idea of judgment waiting 430 years before God perhaps issues his own divine judgments against the iniquities of a particular land. So this is what Israel was supposed to do in Canaan. And the reason this is so important is that as we see today, whether we look at Europe or whether we look at America, you find that competing cultures with different ideologies have a very difficult time coexisting in the same society and in the same environment. And the reason for this is that you have different self-interest. You want to promote your people. You want to promote the welfare, the justice, the morality, and the rights of your particular group of people. The problem is that your rights and your ideas of morality, your values and your standards will often contradict and compete against a different group of people. So those are some of the conflicts that we have in society. God's remedy for this was cleanse the land, let those people go live in another territory and another place. Let them claim a different land, but this land is yours. And remember, the entire reason that God gave the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants was because of partly a crime that had been committed by either Canaan or by Ham. And Noah issued a curse against Ham, and he said he took a portion of land away from Canaan and he gave a double portion to Shem. Well, this double portion of inheritance goes through Shem's firstborn sons until the time of Abraham. And Abraham lived right after the Tower of Babel, and he departed out of Ur of Mesopotamia right at that point in time to go and claim his inheritance. At this particular point in time, Shem would still be alive. So when Abraham claims his inheritance, Shem is alive, and he probably even commands Abraham to go to Canaan to claim this birthright possession. So, and the reason that Abraham is also deemed worthy is because Yehovah says that he obeys. He obeys his statutes, judgments, and commandments. It states that in Genesis 26, right around verses 5 and 6. So you find all of these ideas within Scripture being universal, and they really apply to all societies, and really not just Israel in many sense of the word. Now, here's the key where Israel is concerned, and why is this command so important? Well, God told Israel that if they did not dispossess the land, if they did not dwell in it, and if they did not divide the land, that this would be the consequence. Let me see if I can get this to, okay. The consequence would be that if you will not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come to pass that those which you let remain among you shall be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your side, and shall vex you in the land where you dwell. And this is what you find, especially during the Judges era. Had Israel totally dispossessed the Canaanites, there would have been no one to oppress Israel when she rebelled. Rather, Israel would have had her own consequence of her own policies, but there would not have been an external force except perhaps Egypt coming into the land and directly oppressing Israel. What you find happened during the Judges era is that Egypt would leverage all the petty kingdoms, Hatzor, Megiddo, even perhaps some of the Amalekites. Egypt would leverage those tribes against Israel, and that really provided an increased oppression, whereas if Israel had obeyed, it simply would have been Egypt, and Egypt would not have had the foothold and territory of land. So, it's much, if you look at Iraq, for instance, Iraq deals with a lot of enemies in its own land. But if the Americans are seen as an enemy on Iraqi land, they have to have some sort of local tribesmen in which to work with in order to combat militants within Iraq. Well, you can view America as either an ally or as an enemy, depending on which side of the political divide you're on. But if America did not have allies in Iraq, it would be much more difficult for America to implement its policies in a foreign land. The same thing for Egypt. If Israel had obeyed, it would have been much more difficult for Egypt to have implemented its policies in Canaan. As we come into the monarchy, you find that a lot of the tribes that had been nemesis during the Judges era really come back to haunt Israel at the fall of the kingdom. And we're going to see this more next week than what we are this week. But you find that the tribes begin to deport Israel off of the land the same way that Israel had once deported the Canaanites off of the land. So it's really karma, you could say, where if you don't obey the command, then it comes back to haunt you. And this is the judgment. I'm getting ahead of myself here because this is the final judgment. And this is what Yehovah says. He says, moreover, it shall come to pass that I will do to you as I thought to do to them. So what is it that God's going to do? He is going to dispossess Israel. He's going to divide the land, and he's going to put foreigners. As a matter of fact, the law says that he will bring foreigners, the worst of the heathen, it says, to dwell in your stead. Now, one thing that I did not put in here, or at least I did not bold it, the other command associated with this is to destroy the Canaanites' pictures, to destroy their molten images, and quite pluck down all their high places. That's Numbers 33:52. You know, this is kind of the same thing that ISIS has done in our days. The reason this is important in Israel's history and in the context of Israel's history is the fact that when a people have history on a land, when they have buildings, they have monuments, they have things that attest to their presence and their ownership of a land. When it comes to generations later, we have this discussion as to whose right it is to be upon that land. We can go back for Israel and we can show all sorts of Israelite memorabilia, of inscriptions, of bulle, of different items that identify Israel as one point in time being a possessor of that land, and that justifying a modern legitimacy to that land. If we go back to an archaeological context and we find Canaanite inscriptions, we find other inscriptions of other people, then in some lines of thinking, it justifies other tribal or other national claims to the promised land. So this is very important as far as inheritance and as far as looking in a forward prophetic type outlook as far as who has right to the land. So destroying memorabilia also destroys claim to the land. Whereas when you have that epigraphy, when you have those monuments, it demonstrates that your ancestors were once there and that then you have the right to be there as well. So what we're going to focus on tonight's class is this process that God took to efface Israel's memory off of the promised land. I do call this an effacement judgment because it does efface Israel's memory on the land. And you find that what God did propose to do the Canaanites, he does do to Israel. And that's the process we're going to look at tonight. Now, I just wanted, before we go into the actual evidence of Israel's diaspora, I wanted to just recap some of the inscriptions that we have that testify to ancient Israel. Now, in past classes, we've looked at the Tel Dan inscription that refers to the house of David. We've also looked at the Mesha inscription and an inscription that can be loosely reconstructed to the word Goliath that was found at Gath. The other thing that we have is the Armana tablet that refers to the Aparu and their conquest of Israel during the time of the judges. Now, I did not have time to go in and look at every single psalm, but there are about 5 psalms where the title of the psalm says, "For an inscription." Now, this is very important because many of these psalms would have been monumental inscriptions, very similar to what you see in this Mesha inscription, where they would have been displayed publicly in Jerusalem, whether they were near the temple, in the temple precincts, or in the palace, maybe on the walls of the palace, similar to what we see in Assyria. You would have had these inscriptions in Jerusalem. And I will try to post it on the Yahweh Exists page later this week, and also on my personal Facebook page. But there are about 5 psalms that David wrote, and he specifically designates those for inscriptional purposes. But yet today we don't have one evidence of those inscriptions because they have all been destroyed by the nations that conquered Israel. So the only evidence that we have to a formal nation of Israel, and I did not put on here the Israelite stele, which is Menerptah's reference to Israel, and that is the first reference to the people of Israel living in the land of Canaan. So when you look at it, all the evidence that we have really comes from other nations outside of Israel, and it really demonstrates how complete the destruction of Israel was. Some other archaeological evidence that we have to ancient Israel is the name of Ishbal, which does not appear later in scripture, and we don't find it appearing later in the archaeological context too. I've mentioned over and over again this phenomena of names and the popularity of names, where a particular name will be in use for about 100 years or within 1 or 2 generations, and then it falls into disuse, and you really don't see it resurface again in a historical context. The other archaeological evidence that scholars have excavated is going to be David's palace and the Milo. This again represents the early Davidic kingdom, and it provides evidence for the nation of Israel. Now, some of the newer things that we have come across, and I say newer because of the Hezekiah seal. I had to grab a glass of water there. When I was in Israel last year, I had the pleasure of meeting Lenny Wolf, who is one of the top Israeli antiquities dealers. In fact, this past January, he donated some Babylonian, not Babylonian, but Iranian documents from the Jews living in what would have been ancient Babylon, and they had a sort of family history, and he bought those documents and he donated them to the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem. And what he told me, he said that the Hezekiah seal, he says there are literally hundreds of them everywhere. Every antiquities dealer has hundreds of them because they were so prolific. What had not occurred, and the reason they were not considered legitimate according to academic scholarship, is simply because they had not yet been found in situ. In other words, they had not been found in their original archaeological context and excavated in the controlled archaeological setting where you could identify the stratum in which they were found, and you could identify exactly where they were. So it comes down to provenance. Where did it come from? Where was the site of its original location? As you all know, or probably you all know, about 9 months ago, a year ago, the Hezekiah seal was found in an archaeological context. So now these seals are deemed legitimate. Most of the seals that you see do indeed look like the one on this particular slide. And again, there are hundreds of them. The other inscription that we have to attest to the monarchy is the Salome inscription. This was an inscription inscribed on the wall of a tunnel. So when Sennacherib sieged Jerusalem, water was an issue. What you did in ancient warfare is you would siege a city and cut off all of its water supplies, cut off all of its food supplies. The people would eventually starve to death. They would fall prey to disease. And as that occurred, the city would eventually surrender. Well, when Sennacherib sieged Jerusalem, Hezekiah, knowing this was going to happen, had his engineers dig a tunnel from a springs that existed outside the city. And this tunnel brought the spring and brought water into the city. And this inscription describes the process that these engineers took and describes their meeting, their meeting in the process of excavating the tunnel. So this dates right around 715 BCE. And again, this is going to be, of course, midway through the monarchy. Now, another inscription that we have, it was found at Megiddo. This would have been another that would have been in situ. In other words, it would have been in an archaeological context. It was a signet, and the signet reads, Shema, servant of Jeroboam. So this was a signet that would have belonged to one of Jeroboam's constituents, and he was probably a high-ranking official. But what this attests to is the fact that the story, as we have in Scripture, is backed up with archaeological evidence. So we may not be given the exact history, but we can collaborate many of the people that are mentioned in Scripture. The next thing that we find, and this one is not so well known, this is the Azekah inscription. This is written in Akkadian, and this was written by Sennacherib. And I'm getting a little out of context because we're not actually going to get into Sennacherib tonight. But the Azekah inscription is fascinating because Sennacherib refers to Hezekiah's Sabbath. Some scholars take this to be the weekly seventh-day Sabbath, but in the context of Isaiah, remember that when Sennacherib sieges Jerusalem, Isaiah gives him a sign, and he says, "Eat you this year of all that comes out of the land, and the next year, the land will lie fallow, and in the third year you will eat." So there's this idea that this would have been a jubilee. If you recall from chapter 9, when we went through the chronology, we discovered that the Jubilee year indeed falls within, I think it is Hezekiah's 15th year. I'm going to look here real quick. I did not put that in my notes for tonight, so bear with me. I'm just going to find this really quick. Yeah, Hezekiah's Jubilee would have been in 708 BCE, and I believe this was the 14th and 15th year of his reign. So the reference to an invasion of an invasion of Judah, and also a reference to Hezekiah's Sabbath, again, this provides support for the biblical narrative and also for the book of Isaiah, which both refer to a sabbatical Jubilee year occurring during Hezekiah's reign. The other thing that we have, and I'm not including every single evidence for the monarchy that that scholars have found. What I am doing is simply highlighting. There are others, and I will eventually put those into a book that I plan to release. But this one is very strong because this is the priestly blessing, and it is on a silver scroll. Scholars painstakingly unraveled the scroll, and they discovered something very fascinating on it. I'm just going to go ahead and read this. These silver scrolls were two amulets dating from the late 7th century BCE. They were found in the fourth of several burial caves that I forgot the name of the scholar. Galil, I believe, was the scholar who discovered them. And he discovered them on an escarpment known as Kedef Hinnom, which overlooks the Hinnom Valley just opposite of Mount Zion. Each amulet contained a rolled up sheet of silver, which unrolled revealed the priestly benediction. Now, what is an amulet? An amulet was something that you would either wear around your neck, you would carry it on your person. And it was thought if you had this object, that it would somehow protect you from whatever calamity could possibly molest you. This was not the original use of the priestly blessing. Originally, the priestly blessing is something that the priest would do in order to actually bless Israel, but the blessing itself was not seen as an amulet, but rather a God-given blessing for following Torah. In this, as of course, as we know, the prophets tell us over and over again, Israel really wanted the superstition. They wanted the mystery religion. So they sought to the pagan religions, and they would often combine those with the worship of Yehovah and with a pseudo following of Torah. So it was always mingled during the monarchy years. And in this case, the priestly blessing evolved into an amulet. Now what we're going to do is get into the evidence for the deportations and assaulting, both the assaulting and deportations of the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel. So again, we find at this point in time, Israel is split into two nations. And the first assault that Israel has is going to be on the northern kingdom. Now, why is the northern kingdom attacked first? There's at least two reasons. Number one, throughout Scripture, it says that Jeroboam, the first Jeroboam, set up calves for Israel to worship. He led Israel to the worship of other deities. And you find this phrase that is used, it's kind of a formatic phrase throughout Israel's history. And it says that whatever monarch it was that succeeded Jeroboam says, behold, he followed in the ways of Jeroboam who taught Israel to sin. So exactly, Patty, it was idolatry. So the first reason is that you find that Israel continued to walk in idolatry. They never repented from their evil ways to follow Yehovah. There was never, Judah, you find in Judah's history, Judah would stray, there would be a renaissance, they'd come back, Judah would stray, and within 3 generations, they would come back. You find that this 3 generations holds until the very last of the monarchy, where it's that 4th generation that is finally judged and the kingdom is destroyed. For Israel, you know, whether it's Jehu or whether it's Jeroboam, you find that 3 generations of monarchs continually rebelled. None of them repented and sought Yehovah. So that is the first reason. The second reason is the geographical position. Israel was in the north, and by being in the north, it was a buffer zone to Judah. When Assyria attacked, they did not come across a barren desert that was very unforgiving and very difficult to cross. As a matter of fact, Cyrus, king of Persia, lost an entire army in the desert when he tried to cross it. So most people knew that you just simply did not try to cross that desert. So when you came to attack Judah, you first had to go through northern Israel. And usually the course was you attacked Syria first, and then you would attack the northern kingdom of Israel. We have the first contact that we have from Assyria involves Ahab, king of Israel, and then Jehu. And what this chart shows is that Shalmaneser right here describes meeting Ahab in battle. And he refers to him as the son of Omri. Now, the biblical text is a little bit ambiguous because it makes it look as though Ahab was fighting with Syria and that they were at war. This actually was not the case. And this may have been written from the perspective of Judah, and they may not simply have had all the facts. So what you find is that Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria or Ephraim, had at one point in time been adversaries. They had fought back and forth. By the time we get to Ahab, the old wounds had healed, and they found that with the increasing pressure from Assyria, that an alliance was very advantageous. So Ahab makes an alliance with Syria, and with the incoming encroaching aggression from Shalmaneser, Ahab sends troops. Ahab himself fights with Syria as a confederate against Shalmaneser. So Shalmaneser tells us that he was the victor of this. In fact, he says that the ground gave out when it came time to bury the Israelites. There were not enough graves for them to be buried. So this is something that provides a new context to the biblical record. And it's fascinating because Shalmaneser, if you look at the chronology here, Shalmaneser's 6th year, Shalmaneser dates this battle to the 6th year of his reign, which parallel scripture would have been the 22nd year of Ahab. When you go 12 years further, you find that in the 18th year of Shalmaneser, he refers to meeting Jehu, king of Israel. So the chronology here is impeccable with how the chronology of the biblical text matches and coincides perfectly with that of Assyria. So this leads a great deal of validity to the biblical account, to the biblical record, when the dates coincide with such precision. The other thing that we have is that, remember, the first contact that Assyria has is going to be with Ahab, who is the son of Omri. So for Assyria, who is used to having ruling dynasties, the northern kingdom of Israel becomes the house of Omri. And as we're going to see, the northern kingdom becomes known to Assyria as Omri land. So Assyria's first contact was with the house of Ahab, was with Ahab, son of Omri. For the rest of the nation's history, Assyria would be recognized, the northern kingdom, as Omri land. So just kind of tuck that in your head, so we don't really see the term Israel within Assyrian archives, but we do see the term Omri land. The next thing that we find is that Assyria called the kingdom of Judah Iudah. So here we have, I'm going to not go too far. Here we have the first extra biblical reference to the kingdom of Judah right in the 8th century BCE. So we can vouch for both the kingdom of Israel as well as the kingdom of Judah at this point in time in history. The next piece of evidence that we have that attests to Israel and Judah also comes from Shalmaneser III. And this is known as the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser. And what this shows is Jehu bowing before Shalmaneser. He's bringing him tribute. And I want to point something out, a particular detail of this. And I don't know if you guys can see Jehu's tail right here, where he kind of has a flayed, not a tapestry, my mind is going blank here, but he has a tailed fringe on his garment. I have often argued that when scripture says to wear tzitzits on your garments, that this is very well what scripture had in mind. You will see that the Assyrians also have them. The difference being that God commanded Israel tzitzits to be red and blue. It appears that we know from earlier depictions of Aparus from Canaan that the red and blue were both deemed compatible as fulfillment of that prophecy, or that rather that command in Numbers, which command them to wear the tzitzits, or the fringes, along the borders of the garment. So this very well may be an accurate depiction of what a historical tzitzit was. But here again we have Jehu bowing before Shalmaneser. Now what's fascinating with this is that scripture tells us that Shalmaneser, or that Jehu, contributed 1,000 talents of silver. Shalmaneser also recognizes this 1,000 talents of silver tribute to Assyria. The next person that we're going to see that plays a significant role in Israel's history is going to be Tiglath-Pileser. Now, I just want to mention, you know, if all of this seems a little confusing, turn in your appendix to Appendix B, or Appendix A at the very back of the book. And right around page 881, you're going to see a timeline where all of these kings are put on one time scale. So you're going to see the king of Assyria, the king of Israel, the king of Judah, and even the king of Damascus. You're going to see how all of these interplay with each other, even Egypt. Anybody that has a significant role in Israel's history, you're going to see them displayed on this chart at the end of the book. Again, this is going to be right around page 880, and you can follow this, and it really brings some cohesion to Israel's history when you see how the chronology delves into each other. So Tiglath-Pileser is an interesting character for one reason. The chronology of his reign has some issues. I argue in Yahweh Exists that when he was king of Assyria, they dated his inscriptions by the name of Tiglath-Pileser, and they had one set sequence of dating. When he conquered Babylon, it appears that for whatever reason, the sequence of his reign was restarted again by many of his scribes. So it does not give the full picture of the duration and the length of his reign, which was much larger. And you can see this on page 886, where the actual duration of his reign is 38 years, rather than the 18 years that are normally ascribed to him by traditional academia and the studies of chronologies within academic literature. So, but what you find is that when you recognize, when you add his reign over Assyria and then his reign over Babylon, when you add those two together, it matches and coincides perfectly with the chronology that we have for both Israel and Judah. So for northern Israel, this is the information that we have from scripture regarding Pul's interaction with Israel. It says, Pul, the king of Assyria, came again to the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to confirm the kingdom in his hand. So basically what Menahem is doing is he is buying Assyria off. He is paying Assyria to establish him as the monarch in Israel. It says, and Menahem exacted the money of Israel, even of all the mighty men of wealth, each man 50 shekels of silver, and gave it to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turned back and stayed not there in the land. So basically you have Pul threatening the northern kingdom. He is threatening invasion, and Menahem raises enough capital to buy Assyria off, as well as to secure his power on the throne of the northern kingdom. The next one that we have is, this is the corollary account. Oops, I'm not sure what happened here. I do not know why. Hold on. Let me see. Luke, hey, y'all can't be online when I'm doing my class, son. Y'all just booted me offline. What? At all? You can still hear me. Okay. I'm getting an error occurred. I'm going to reboot this. Okay, we're still there. Okay, thank you guys. I lost my feed, so I assumed that we were totally booted offline. So I'm just going to pick up where I left off. So the corollary account is going to be for Paul of Assyria. And hold on just a minute. My computer is running slow all of a sudden. Okay, here we go. So this is what Paul tells us. He says, as for Menahem, I overwhelmed him like a snowstorm, and he fled like a bird alone and bowed to my feet. I returned him to his place and imposed tribute upon him, to wit, gold, silver, linen garments with multicolored trimmings. Great I received from him, Israel, which literally means Omriland. All its inhabitants and their possessions I led to Assyria. And I'm sorry, that should read led instead of let. This is important. This inscription right here attests to the very first deportation of the Northern Kingdom. So the very first deportation of the Northern Kingdom occurs during the reign of Paul. And let me get the date here just so we have a context. The date would have been right around, let's see, probably right around 756 BCE, 757, 756. Then he goes on to state, they overthrew their king, Pekah, and I placed Hoshea as king over them. I received from them 10 talents of gold, 1,000 talents of silver as their tribute, and brought them to Assyria. This is going to be Annette, pages 283 to 84. So here we have a corollary account that is very compatible with the biblical account. Much of the information is very much similar. Now, we also find that Israel, the northern kingdom, was not the only nation that Assyria accosted. They also accosted Judah. This is what Paul tells us. He says 19 districts of Hamath, which let's go back and talk about the importance of Hamath here real quick. Hamath, let's go back even further. In Genesis 22, with the burnt offering covenant, God tells Abraham that because he was willing to offer Isaac as a burnt offering, that for that blessing, Israel will inhabit, they will possess the gates of their enemies. Well, Hamath was a city, was a port city on Taurus River. It was a wealthy trading center, and it was a city that was owned by Judah. It was a Judite possession. And it was a Judite possession way north of the land. Judah retained this possession even under the divided monarchy. So but during the invasion by Paul, it was at this point in time that Judah lost Hamath, together with the cities and their environments, which lie on the shore of the sea at the setting of the sun, which had gone over to Azariah in revolt. So what you find is that as Paul begins to invade, as he begins to put pressure on the land, that a lot of these people begin to make alliances, and a lot of the local cities ally with Judah, even though they're very far in the north, because they see how weak Israel is. And not only is Israel weak, but remember how wicked Menahem was. I mean, he went into cities, he just committed incredible genocide of everyone that did not support his desire to be king in the northern kingdom. So it was a very, very horrific time, something that more than likely would resemble a Holocaust on the land of ancient Israel. So then you find that Paul continues, they went over to Azariah in revolt and contempt of Assyria. I brought within the border of Assyria. My officials I set over them, and governors. 30,300 people I carried off from their cities and placed them in the province of the city, and it is lost. So these people that were deported, some of them would have been from the northern kingdom, but some of them also would have been Judah's garrison forces at Hamath. So you would have had a very mixed multitude of probably Israelites, of Judahites, as well as the other nations, Syrians of the land, that former Hittite territory that lived in that particular area. This and the other thing that is relevant within the reign of Tiglath-Pileser is the Ephraim-Syrian Confederacy when Ahaz was king. If you will remember, throughout the course of Israel's history, they would have intermittent civil wars. They would dwell peaceably, and then either Judah would go and attack Israel, or Israel would go and attack Judah. There are at least 3 separate incidences where they attack each other. Under Ahaz's reign, the situation was that Pekah had made an alliance with Syria, just like Ahab. But this alliance was a little different, and its purpose was a little different. In order to solidify and protect themselves, they thought that the best thing they could do to strengthen their forces would be to invade Judah, to dispose of the Judite monarch, and to place, I believe it was Pekah's son on the throne of Judah. So this confederacy then between Syria, Israel, and Judah would then have the strength and the unity to then withstand the Assyrian aggression into the land of Canaan. And this is the background that we see. And let's just read what scripture says of this confederacy. It says, it came to pass in the day of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to war against it, but could not prevail against it. So again, remember, there's incredible pressure by Assyria on all of these nations at this time. Says, and it was told the house of David, saying, Syria is confederate with Ephraim, and his heart was moved as the heart of his people, as trees of the wood are moved in the wind. So again, it is this tumultuous time period that forms the backdrop of Isaiah 7. And we're going to actually look at this a little bit more, because what Isaiah is going to prophesy of is the fall of both Israel and Syria. And this is what Isaiah says to Ahaz. He says, and take heed and be quiet and fear not. Do not be faint-hearted for the 2 tails of these smoking firebrands, for their fierce anger of Rezin with Syria and the son of Remaliah, who of course was Pekah, says, because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have taken evil counsel against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and vex it. Let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, even the son of Tabeel. So again, Tabeel was another dynasty within the northern kingdom, and they were going to try to dispose of the Judah monarchy and form this alliance to withstand the king of Assyria. says, and thus saith Yehovah, it shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it is not a people. So this is basically within 65 years of Isaiah's prophecy. Isaiah is telling Ahaz that Ephraim will be utterly broken and they will not be a people. Now, this is fascinating because we can actually chart this chronologically. And I do have this on that chart at the very end of the book, right around page 882, 883. I also have this. Let me look real quick because I also have this in the chronology chapter. Let me see if I can find this real quick, where it has Isaiah's 65 years until Israel is not a people. And what we find is that exactly 65 years later, Esarhaddon deports the northern kingdom of Israel utterly and totally, so that only just a fragment of the population remains on the land, and everyone else is truly gone. And what he does is, the prophecy, you can look at page 416. The prophecy is given in 728 BCE to Ahaz, and Esarhaddon deports Samaria, the rest of the territory of the northern kingdom, and somewhere around 664 or 663 BCE. So that would have been the 65 years. So this is a very important prophecy because Syria and Israel are after the Judah throne. And Isaiah continues in this prophecy. We're going to continue now through verse 13. It says, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, surely you will not be established. So what God is telling Ahaz here, he's telling, if you do not believe my promise, if you do not trust in me and my word, then your kingdom will not be established. You will not be established on Judah's throne. So the very thing that you fear with Syria and with Ephraim coming and getting your throne, well, guess what? It may not fall to them, but you will not be established on your throne, and it will be affected by another way. However, it will not be affected by either Ephraim or by Syria. So then he continues and he says, moreover, Yehovah spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask you a sign of Yehovah your God, ask it either in the depth or the highest above. But Ahaz said, I will neither ask, neither will I tempt Yehovah. This statement by Ahaz is an affront. It is an insult. Throughout Israel's history, when a prophet spoke in Yehovah's name, that prophet would give a sign that what he said was of God and that it was the truth. For instance, a sign is given to Hezekiah that he will get well. And he says, ask for a sign. And he says, well, let the sundial go back 10 degrees. You have other signs, whether it's Gideon asking for the fleece. But so many times when a prophet speaks in Yehovah's name, he offers a sign to prove that what he speaks is true. So a prophet never asks someone to simply take his word. He also offers signs that back up his word as being something that God will affect and that God will stand behind. So, but Ahaz rejecting this, not even caring for a sign by God, is the ultimate insult that Ahaz could give to God and that he could give to Isaiah. And Isaiah's answer to him and says, hear now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you also weary my God? And also, let me just say that because of Ahaz's attitude, his throne was not established in Judah. He reigned for a very short period of time. I believe it was about 6 or 9 years. And the elders of Judah formed a coup, and they deposed Ahaz and they established Hezekiah, his son, on the throne in his stead. So you find that, and how we know this is that it states that Hezekiah was crowned king in Allah, while Ahaz retained Jerusalem until his death about 4 years later. So Ahaz's throne was not established. His early monarchy was eclipsed by his father Jotham's reign, and then the later years of his reign were eclipsed by his son. So he really only had about 3 years of independent rule, because the people conspired against him, they rebelled against him, and then they established Hezekiah on the throne. But this is Isaiah's word to Ahaz. It says, "Therefore Yehovah himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and call his name Emmanuel." Now, the word for virgin here does not mean a woman who has never had intercourse. This simply means a young woman. So, in Greek, you don't have that many words for a young woman. In Hebrew, you do. You have multiple words. But a child will be born. His name will be Emmanuel. Says, "Butter and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good." Says, "For before the child shall know to refuse evil and choose good, the land you abhor shall be forsaken of both her kings." Well, what kings are we talking about? We are talking about Rezin, Remaliah, and Pekah. These are the kings that we are talking about, that Isaiah is promising Ahaz that they will be, that they will occur, and they will occur before this child Emmanuel knows to refuse evil and choose good. So we're probably talking within about 4 years this is going to happen, because by the time children get to be about 4, 6 years of age, they pretty much know how to refuse evil and choose good. And Isaiah continues, "Yahweh shall bring upon you and your people and upon your father's house days that have not come, from the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria." So what Isaiah is saying is that from this fracture during the days of Jeroboam and this horrible, horrible epic in history for the United Kingdom, God is going to bring something that has not occurred since that day, and something that's even worse, being the king of Assyria. And in Isaiah 7:18, it says, "And it shall come to pass in that day that Yahweh will hiss for the fly in the utmost part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria." And you find the text goes on, it talks about God, Assyria attacking Egypt, and Assyria attacking the land of Israel. Then Isaiah comes back to the idea of Emmanuel in verses 19 through 20 in chapter 8. Now remember, the ancient text did not have these chapter divisions the way we have today. So it really separates an idea that is really one complete idea. There is no division in the biblical text between this idea of Emmanuel in chapter 7 and the idea of Emmanuel in chapter 8. Isaiah continues and says, "For as much as this people refuses the waters of Shiloh that go softly, and rejoiced in Rezin and Remaliah's son," when, remember, Remaliah's son would have been Pekah, the son of Remaliah, says, "Now therefore Yahweh will bring upon you the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria and all his glory, and he shall come and overflow his channels and go over all his banks. And he shall pass through Judah." I'm not sure if you guys can see this, because there we go. Maybe you can see it now. And he will pass over Judah, and he will overflow and go over, and he will reach unto the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall feel the breath of your land, O Emmanuel. So this point in time, the fact that Assyria would encroach and he would fill the breath of Emmanuel's land, this provides a very clear context for who Emmanuel was and for when he lived. Remember, the opening of Isaiah's prophecy was addressed to the house of David. It is very, very possible that Isaiah spoke this before Ahaz ever came into a co-regency with his father Jotham. So it's very possible that this was given before Hezekiah was ever born, say right around 737 BCE, right as Ahaz was fixing to take on a co-regency. You have Hezekiah being about 16 years of age in 721 BCE when he comes to the throne. So whose land does Assyria attack? Whose land does Assyria encroach, and does he feel the breath of their land? Well, as we're going to see next week, both Paul as well as Sennacherib, they both encroach upon the land of Judah during the reign of Hezekiah. And we're going to, let me go on with Paul here real quick. Okay, right here. King Ahaz sent, so here we have the alliance. Before we get to Hezekiah, we have the alliance between Rezin and between Pekah, Rezin of Syria and Pekah of Ephraim. You could call it Ephraim, the northern kingdom, or Samaria. They're all the same entity. But they have this alliance, and this is how it is fractured. It says, King Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which raised up against me. And Ahaz took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of Yehovah and the treasures of the king's house and sent it as a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria listened to him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus, took it, and carried the people captive to Kir and slew Rezin. So here we have Isaiah offered free of charge, without a payment of tribute, a giving of the heads, basically, of Rezin and Pekah by Assyria, and totally freeing Judah from any malice or any aggression by Assyria. Ahaz chooses not to trust in that. He refuses to accept the prophecy, and he takes matters into his own hands. Taking matters into his own hand came at an extractive and steep tribute that really God had not extracted. This was of Ahaz's own doing because Ahaz would not believe. And again, this would have been very early, either in Ahaz's sole reign at this point, or it was during the co-regency with his father Jotham. The corollary account comes from Paul. And this is what he tells us. He says, I laid siege to and conquered the town of Hadera, an inherited property of Rezin of Damascus, the place where he was born. I brought as prisoners 800 of its inhabitants with their possessions of the 16 districts of the country of Damascus. I destroyed, making them look like hills of ruined cities over which the flood had swept. So here we have a corollary account that backs up the biblical account. And not only that, but we have an account that is chronologically totally in support of the biblical account as well. The other thing that Paul tells us is that he tells us that he deported Naphtali. And I'm sorry, this is not actually a Paul or Tiglath-Pileser. This is to an unknown monarch. It is fragmented, and the part containing the monarch's name is destroyed. But it would have been right at this particular point in time, and scholars do theorize that this was Tiglath-Pileser that deported Naphtali from Ephraim's territories. And this is what the Assyrian inscription records. It says, it says that he deported Byblos, Semera, Aqua, Zemara, Uznu, Ribah, Rizuzu, the towns of the upper sea. I brought under my rule 6 officers of mine I installed as governors over them. The towns of Rashnuta, which is situated on the coast of the Upper Sea, the towns of something, it's a lacuna there, Galzu, Abilka, that which are adjacent to Israel, literally land of Omri, and the wide land of Naphtali, and its entire extent I united with Assyria. Officers of mine I installed as governors. So what we find is that Tiglath-Pileser probably deported Naphtali and united this portion of Syria and of the northern kingdom. Remember, Naphtali was given a territory in the northern parts of the northern kingdom. So this would have taken into account both Syria and the northern parts of Samaria and made it one nation with Assyria. So Ahaz could have had, it is very likely that the king of Assyria was going to do this anyways, whether Ahaz called upon him for help or whether he did not. Assyria already had its eyes set on the land of Canaan, on the land of Israel, and was planning on taking it. So Ahaz really did not have to pay that tribute. But what we find is that because Ahaz did not believe, because he went in his own power and his own might, and he tried to circumvent Yehovah and his prophecy through Isaiah, that he lost his throne in Judah. And that very soon, his son Emmanuel, who would have been Hezekiah, was established on his throne. And we do find, as we will see next week, that Assyria under Sennacherib does invade Judah, and he attacks, he sieges Jerusalem. So when Isaiah says that Assyria will come into the borders of your land, O Emmanuel, this is a prophecy that's been fulfilled. And this prophecy was fulfilled right around 717, 718 BCE. So we can put a very definite time frame as to when this occurred and as to when this happened as far as Israel's history is concerned. Remember, the Azekah inscription references Hezekiah's Shabbat, or Hezekiah's Sabbath. So Sennacherib was a smart guy, and he knew to attack Judah when it was weak. And when is it going to be weak? Well, when its food stores are low, when they have not planted crops, and when they are very vulnerable. But what we find is that God works on Hezekiah's behalf, and he causes Sennacherib to leave Hezekiah. Now, this does not mean that Judah escapes unscathed, because as we will see next week, Sennacherib virtually deported the entire land of Judah, but he did leave Jerusalem and some of the southern cities of Judah. But we're going to investigate and see the evidence for that next week. This week, that does conclude the slideshow for this week. Let me go and get back my screen here. And okay, it's coming back. I'll be back with you. There I am. So that concludes this week's portion of the Assyrian invasions. Next week, we're going to start with Sargon and Sennacherib. Both Sargon and Sennacherib claim to have destroyed Samaria. Samaria was the northern kingdom's capital city. So we're going to see the evidence for that. We're also going to see Judah's fall and its fall to Babylon. And next week we'll actually conclude the historical aspect of the study in Yahweh Exists. The following week, in 3 weeks, we are going to transition into some of the prophecy. You know, we looked at the effacement judgment tonight. The effacement judgment is so important because it shows Yehovah's impartiality. God judged the Canaanites because they had become steeped in iniquity. The sins of the Amorites had come to the full. And now you see that the sins of the Israelites have also come to the full. So God is doing to Israel as he thought to do to the nations that existed before Israel. He is judging them for their iniquities. He is effacing their memory off the land. And archaeology attests to that. You know, all the epigraphic evidence that refers to Israel, it is all cracked, it is all destroyed, it is all in pieces. And we are literally having to work very hard to reconstruct and to put these jigsaw puzzles back together. So, you know, I hope you see the cohesion of this, and you see the harmony, and you see the fulfillment throughout Israel's history, because it is absolutely fascinating. You know, we have so much history for Israel, for Egypt, and for Assyria. We don't question Egypt, we don't question Assyria, but because Israel has a theological context to which most people kind of had to take a prejudiced point of view, it then becomes an issue. So because we don't know, is kind of the theology is a Pandora's box we don't want to open. Rather than tackle the theology, we're simply going to deny Israel and deny that Israel ever existed as a nation. So it's kind of interesting when you see some of the contradictory methods that scholars use in discussing equivalent data, but yet treating it with a pejorative standpoint in their treatment of the evidence. So that does conclude tonight's class. Thank you, James. I appreciate your comments. And I'm glad it comes alive. If it comes alive for you, I've done my job. So, and I saw that Stephen says up here, he says, I counted 490, that's the 70 times 7, from when Abraham first came into the land until the judgment fell, like the 7 sevens Yahweh waited before Babylonian captivity. That's very interesting. You know, I found there's and we're going to get into this more probably in about 5 weeks from now. But when you count those 7 times, you find that they equal 350 years for either the tabernacle existing on the land of Canaan or for the temple existing on the land of Canaan. But you do find that they do exist for 2 times extra for the 400. Excuse me, I'm running dry tonight. They do exist extra for the 490 years, which we will discuss that in probably about 3 or 4 weeks from now. The sequence, just to give you guys a sequence, next week I mentioned we will be finishing up the historical aspect. We will be transitioning into more of the prophetic and theological aspects of the biblical text. And I want to encourage everyone, if you have not done so, please go back, read chapter 3, read chapter 4, and even if you have time, read chapter 1. Those chapters really set up a solid context of covenants, of blessings, of curses, and of the division of the blessings between the 12 sons of Jacob, for us to then have a lucid discussion of the facts of what the temple was. Why was it important for ancient Israel? Did it have a meaning simply beyond being a physical edifice to which people simply brought sacrifices? So we're going to see a broader context for the temple, the reason why it was important for ancient Israel, and we're also going to see how the structure itself prophesied of events to occur in ancient Israel's future. So it's going to get very interesting. From there, we're going to go into the aspects of the stipulations, the curses, the prophetic curses of Israel's law. And we're going to see how Leviticus 26 totally parallels Deuteronomy 28. And when you see that come together, it really makes the scripture come alive, because rather than seeing everything fragmented and seeing everything that really has no relationship to one topic to another, you're going to see it all come together, and it's going to make incredible sense. So I hope that will come alive for you as well. So Shabbat Shalom. I invite you all to join me tomorrow morning at 10:30 a.m. for, and I'm not going to say Roots of Faith, I'm going to say for the United Israel Gathering in St. Francisville. I don't know that Ross will be broadcasting from the new building yet. And a little secret, I might be able to be the first person to broadcast from that building because I will be teaching there next Shabbat. Tomorrow will be Ross, and the following Shabbat I will be there. And I hope to see you all then. And I hope you have a wonderful Shabbat. There was something else I wanted to tell you. It's not coming to me right now, so I'll just post it on my Facebook page. Yes, our Torah portion this week. So Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I will see you guys twice next week. So have a great one. Oh, this is what I was going to say. If you guys don't mind, if you will click the little thumbs up button in the lower left-hand corner, I certainly would appreciate it. Shabbat Shalom. Talk to y'all later.